full NHS approval for it, because it's not aimed at diseases or things that NICE would look at. But this randomised controlled trial is the first really of its kind, and it clearly shows the benefits of people doing things in the Zoe program in this holistic way.
Are there risks though as well? Because he was talking about people possibly being put at risk of eating disorders by becoming so obsessed with every twist and turn of what they're eating.
I think there are always some people who are susceptible to these. So in that, I think there is some truth in that, and that's why we exclude people with eating disorders and certainly discourage anybody with those sort of tendencies from taking Zoe and getting too obsessed with these glucose monitors. But most of these programs are a one-off test, so it's not like you are doing this for more than 2 weeks.
Understood.
So most people can cope with that and don't get obsessed and feel that they're getting much more insight into what they're eating, what their body's telling them. And I think ultimately with the NHS in meltdown, people need to take care of their health themselves, and preventive medicine, this is what we're all about.
Professor Tim Spector, thank you.
17 minutes to 9. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he has signed off on plans for a ground offensive into Rafah city, the overcrowded enclave where 1.5 million civilians are sheltering. Talk to Jeremy Byrne, our international editor. And Jeremy, President Biden has talked about this before as a red line.
He has, and there is a massive breakdown of relations between Netanyahu and the Biden administration in general. The senior, Senate leader Chuck Schumer, who is a very prominent Jew and friend of Israel in the United States, has said that Netanyahu has to go. The Americans are not, however, taking away the diplomatic cover or the supplies of weaponry, but they are very displeased by the way that Israel has been conducting the war. But I think this Rafah offensive is going ahead. I've just spent the last few days at a conference in Oxfordshire with a lot of people, Middle East analysts and others, diplomats and so on, in a place called Ditchley. And very much we've been talking a lot about the prospects for this Rafah offensive, and it seems pretty certain that it isn't just Netanyahu who's behind it, it's also other members of his war cabinet who are also at the same time his political opponents and indeed enemies.
Yeah, and he's also said the Israeli military is preparing to try and evacuate nearly 1.5 million civilians there, and that sounds like an incredible undertaking. Is that possible?
Well, we've also been discussing that a lot here too, and you think about it, the suggestion is that they might have some humanitarian islands. What does that mean? Some kind of lager there where they put people in? I don't know. And then higher up in northern Gaza, there's some suggestion that maybe some would be moved up there, but at the moment there is absolutely nothing for them there. Yes, aid is starting to come in, though not nearly as much as they need. Yes, the Americans will be arriving to build some kind of temporary or maybe ultimately permanent dock or pier to land aid, which actually will sort of effectively break the Israeli blockade of Gaza if it goes into action. But, to move that many people and to conduct a massive military operation seems to me to be a recipe for a disaster and for many more civilian casualties. Northern Gaza itself, I was there with the Israeli army months ago in November, early in the war, and they'd already turned it into a wasteland, so goodness knows what state it's in now.
Okay, Jeremy, thank you. Jeremy Byrne there, our international editor.
Time now is 40 minutes to 9. 10 years ago, John Humphreys, remember him, went to visit Knepp, the estate in Sussex, which has become famous for wilding, for turning agricultural land into habitat for animals, plants and insects. We've been back to discover what's been happening since then. The owners, Charlie Burrell and Isabella Tree, have faced criticism from farmers who believe that land should be kept for food production. The couple maintain it's possible for both approaches to live side by side. Isabella's just launched a new version of her best-selling book Wilding, with illustrations by Angela Harding, whose lino cuts and watercolours of wildlife you'll recognise from lots of book covers and prints. We began our walk around Knepp by watching the birds, whose presence has become an emblem of the Wilding project.
That's the bill clattering of the storks. So this amazing sound they make when they meet a mate on a nest or a likely piece of territory, and they just throw their heads back and bill clatter. It's a sound that you can actually hear for miles if it's on the right day.
They're large birds, aren't they? Black and white birds with the red beak, and they become very much a symbol of Knepp.
They have, I mean, they're so conspicuous, so easy to spot. You don't have to have a pair of binoculars to be able to identify them. And it's almost like having, there's something prehistoric or even, you know, like a pterodactyl about them. Seeing them in the skies, we've been missing this creature for hundreds and hundreds of years.
Somebody who's been looking at the storks very closely with her binoculars is the illustrator Angela Harding, who's been doing lots of wonderful pictures here and about in Knepp. And I've got a picture of your storks in front of me from the new book. Do you remember your first moment of seeing them?
I do. I've never seen them before. So I dashed out on my trusty little folding bike, but rather too quickly. As I kept zooming past them, I couldn't see any storks anywhere. So I stayed still, and then all of a sudden a dark shadow went over me, and it was like a moment from Avatar as I looked up, and there was this enormous bird, and it was just the most awe-inspiring thing.
But what I love about Angela's illustrations is the kind of energy in them. You can feel that bird coming to life, and you actually see even the air around it looks like it is reverberating with sound.
One of the reasons we were interested to come back to Knepp is to explore the idea of, this is a very mature now rewilding project that you began back in the late 90s, I think. What would this area that we're looking at now is scrub, it's filled with brambles and sallow. What would it have looked like back then?
It's so difficult to imagine, isn't it? But literally 15 years or so ago, it would have been a field of wheat or barley or maize as far as the eye can see. It would have been absolutely flat as a pancake and, you know, a typical arable field. And now it feels, I don't know, sort of medieval, or some people come to Knepp and liken it to Africa because there's just nothing like this left in our landscape.
I'm in my 60s now, mid-60s, but coming to Knepp was like going back to being a 20-year-old when you were watching the verges here, the wildflowers that I used to see in my youth, cycling the lanes then. So this morning I went out and I was 20 again on my bicycle.
Well, I'm going to try that method. Sounds very handy. You clearly converted some people, but there is resistance as well. It's often described as the green lash amongst farmers who say we shouldn't be taking land out of food production. That's very important to the food security of the country.
That's absolutely right. We'll always need land for food production. But where we see rewilding fitting with that is supplying the life support systems for that food production. So rewilding can increase the water tables, it can clean the water, it can hold back flooding, it can provide the pollinating insects to pollinate the crops, it can provide the natural pest control so you don't have to use pesticides, and it can provide the actual physical buffers against extreme weather events, preventing wind blow and storms from destroying crops. So rewilding really is the fingers, the webbing that moves through the productive landscape to actually bolster yields and food production.
We've come inside now to a converted cow barn, a lovely old beamed building, and we're looking at a map which shows how Knepp has spread.
Well, exactly. I think this is the next project, really. You know, we've done something extraordinary has happened here at Knepp, but it's on, you know, a relatively small piece of land. The next thing we have to do is really connect with other people, with other landowners, farmers, people with gardens, so that our nature reserves aren't these little tiny isolated pockets, these oases, which are doomed to fail. I think that's how we all need to be thinking. Not only how can we rewild our own patch, but where are we in relation to others? Looking at maps, literally, talking to Wildlife Trust, talking to our neighbours. What can we do together to make sense of our landscapes and mend them again, create this webbing, this life support system again? Okay, so this is the entrance to the beaver pen.
Duck through the fence to get through.
Very
Shall I get
important
the
to
gate?
close.
Very
Yeah.
important to close the gate. Don't want any escapologist beavers making a mad dash for freedom.
It's incredibly difficult to imagine now, but it was originally, was just fed by one small tiny stream in a ditch.
Now it's completely flooded landscape, like a flooded jungle almost.
Exactly, this is a 6-acre pen, and it's pretty much the entire pen is now water, so we're going to have to tiptoe around the outside. But they've transformed it into this amazing watery kingdom. There's about 5 dams in here now, holding back probably 5 acres of standing water, and that's an incredible effect for downstream flood management. So we are really holding on to water in times of big rains like we've just had. This is their dam. It's the first one they've built. It's one of the biggest ones, and you see how well it's holding. In there at the moment, they've got 2 kits from last year, and they'll be diving underneath, getting into that lodge, and then there'll be a dry shelf where they sleep with a kind of nest where they'll have their young, hopefully later in the spring.
I feel like we're leaving a kind of lost world now as we're heading out of the beaver enclosure.
It's amazing, isn't it? But I hope in not too long you won't be seeing fences next time you come, and these beavers will be back in our landscape creating wonderful watery kingdoms wherever they go.
And Isabella Tree's book Wilding, How to Bring Wildlife Back, an illustrated guide, is out now.
6 minutes to 9, let's have some vintage comedy.
I'm not going any further until I hear Adam say that we're heavy metal.
Okay, we're heavy metal, okay? Heavy metal, heavy metal.
This is heavy, get it?
You're a failure and a disgrace to our ancient circus family. You're good for nothing, John Major.
I'm sorry, Dad. I've been made Prime Minister.
What are we gonna do, John? The kiddies were yelling, "Where's Coco?" Nearly had to give them their money back.
Well, I'll have a word with central government, but there is this war looming in the Gulf.
I don't want to hear about it, John. I think it'd be a nice gesture if you offered to muck out the elephant.
That's the Bad News Tour and the Red Nose of Courage there. Classics from the Comic Strip presents the very early years of what was then described as alternative comedy, now over 40 years old. Jennifer Saunders, Dawn French, Rick Mayall, Ed Edmonds, Alexi Sale, Nigel Planer all cut their teeth and changed the face of comedy during the early 80s. Nigel Planer is on the line, and as Peter Richardson, who wrote, directed and appeared in many of those comic strip outings, is here in the studio. I'm afraid we can't offer you lashings of ginger beer, which was the phrase that you made famous back then, Peter Richardson. But Nigel, for those who don't know it, what was the comic? How did it start?
Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
And how it started, well, it was a live club originally, a gang of us, the 2 double acts originally, myself and Peter. Morning, Peter.
Hello.
Hello, Nigel. And Rick Nell, Adrian Edmondson, and Alexi Sale was the compere. And then we were joined by Dawn and Jennifer, French and Saunders. And we were a live club in Soho in London, and then we went on tour round the UK, round Australia. And then eventually we ended up on Channel 4 making these films that you've just heard some little bits of.
Yeah, Five Go Mad in Dorset, Strike, GLC, plenty of classics in there.
Plenty of them. And I think Peter would know this better than I, but I think there's over 40 films, isn't there? that we
Yes.
made over the years, because we kept returning to it. You know, a few years ago by, and then we'd go back and Peter would have a new idea, and we'd go back and do a new one.
We're a long-running comedy show.
Well, listen, long running, but at the time it was like it was seen as alternative comedy. Did you feel like you were doing something new? Did it, you know, you were called alternative comedy? What was alternative about
I
it?
think
What did it feel
Time
like?
Out called us the Gorillas of New Wave Humour, which is quite a nice title.
Yeah, Alexi used to say, I'm an alternative comedian, which means I'm not funny.
But it felt quite anarchic. I was probably 12, 13 years old at the time. Was it anarchic, or was it quite carefully scripted? Sometimes it takes a lot of organisation to look that disorganised. Peter?
No, we scripted them. I mean, they were pretty heavily scripted. We did add stuff to them as with the characters. I mean, we have such great comedians like, you know, Rick Mail and Robbie Coltrane and Lexi and Nigel, of course, and Adrian, and people that, you know, they were such good performers. They added, obviously, to the scripts as we filmed them.
And you're taking it back on the road. There's going to be a series of films with some clips with some of the casts.
We had a great time at BFI last summer screening some of these films, and the Picture House Cinemas have invited us to do a tour of their cinemas, which we're starting next week in Piccadilly with Richard Herring co-hosting it. And we've got guest Jennifer Saunders and Steve Mangan, who played Tony Blair in our film Humphrey Tony Blair.
It was always thought of as kind of left-wing humour, but you had a pop at the left as well. I mean, the Hunt for Tony Blair didn't pull any punches, did it?
Oh, I think we